Ever had one of those days that started off as the best day of your life and ended up being the worst day of your life? Catherine, the subject of our story today, knows exactly what that feels like. Catherine grew up in a densely forested rural area in central Virginia. And like most kids her age, she was 10 at the time of this story, she spent a lot of time playing in the woods. She and her best friend Stephanie had found a creek one day while they were walking through the woods exploring different deer trails. And this creek happened to be a really rare find and the perfect place for them to play. It was wide and deep enough to swim, and it had nice mossy covered banks that they could crawl out and rest on when they got tired of swimming. The water was cool and clear, and there were no copperheads and no mosquitoes because the river was constantly running. They were psyched. And after a few hours of swimming, they had to walk back home for lunch. But they made plans to pack a picnic lunch and go back the next day, have a picnic on the creek banks, and stay there the rest of the day. So the next day, they set out about 1 o'clock, planning to have their picnic first and then swim when they were done. And they entered the woods in the same spot as they had the day before. And they started following what they thought was the same deer trail. But it wasn't. At the point where they should have found the creek, instead, they found a small clearing that was covered in huge, thick ferns. They had definitely never passed this before. So, being both hungry and tired of walking, they decided to eat their lunch in the little clearing. So they laughed and played around there for a little while, spitting watermelon seeds at each other from their lunches. It was an absolute blast, and they were both in wonderful giddy moods. That all changed, however, as soon as they packed up and headed out to try to find their creek. As they walked on, the woods started to feel darker and colder. Both of them were getting a little skittish, and Catherine noticed that Stephanie kept whipping her head around to look behind them. And after about a half an hour of walking, they came upon what looked like an overgrown bathroom. Sink, toilet, bathtub, all arranged around each other and covered in ivy. Now, it's not uncommon to find some weird stuff out there in the middle of the woods. So they just walked on and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. And after another hour of walking and not seeing anything they recognized, they started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, now they were just trying to find their way home, or at least out of the woods. And Catherine told Stephanie they should follow the sun. If they did, they would either find a road or they would come across somebody's property where they could get some help. But Stephanie insisted on another way, and they began yelling at each other, both out of fear and, to be honest, little girl bossiness. And Catherine told Stephanie that if she thought she was so right, she should just go her way and they could find out who got out first. So they split up. Now, as an adult, Catherine fully acknowledges she was being a stubborn brat and an idiot. Worst possible thing they could have done. Not 10 minutes after they split up, Catherine starts hearing what sounds like somebody walking behind her about 100 feet. And thinking it was Stephanie that had changed her mind and decided to go Catherine's way, Catherine slowed down a little bit so she could catch up. But instead, whatever it was matched her pace. Catherine would slow down, it would slow down. Catherine would stop, it would stop. And this went on for hours. And the whole time, Catherine's going back and forth, wondering, is this all in her head? Or is somebody really following her? She bent down and picked up a big stick, swung it a few times to make sure it was sturdy just in case she had to hit someone, and trucked on. As it began to get dark, Catherine came upon something that made her heart sink into her stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. She had just walked in a huge circle for hours, despite the fact that she was sure she was following the setting sun to the west. Confused and frustrated, she just sat down on a log and screamed her little heart out while she pounded her stick on the ground. And as she tried to collect herself, she heard the footsteps again coming up to her from behind. And she called out as loud as she could, "Stephanie!" No answer. After a short pause, the steps began to run at her. So she jumped up and booked it as fast as she could in the opposite direction. And as she's sprinting through the darkening woods, she begins to hear what she thinks sounds like church bells. And she looked up to see the deepest, darkest cloud she has ever seen in her life. The middle of it was so dark, it was like looking into the night sky, and the dark gray around it seemed to be swirling, and it gave her a horrible feeling when she looked at it, almost like the nausea that you get from looking in binoculars for too long. And what sickened her further is realizing that the sound of the church bells was coming from inside that black hole, and they were deafeningly loud. They were booming. And when she realized this, she stopped dead in her tracks, and she felt a sense of absolute dread that has never been matched in all of her 24 years of life on this planet. And something in her head started screaming that if she didn't get away from whatever in the hell that cloud thing was, no one would ever see her again. She would be gone. However, she did not want to run back in the direction of whatever that thing was that's chasing her. So she took a sharp right and ran away from both of them. By now, it's completely dark outside, and she is running blind through the woods, smacking into branches, tripping over tree roots for what seems like at least another hour, until she smacked into something low and flew over the top of it. And she hit the ground so hard that all of the air in her lungs was knocked out. And as she's laying there trying to recover, she realizes she doesn't hear the bells anymore. And once her eyes adjusted to the dark a little bit better, she realizes that the thing that made her go head over heels was actually a fence. Grabbing a hold of this fence, she prayed that if she just followed it, it would take her to a farm. And sure enough, it did. She walked up over a hill about a mile to the back of a farmhouse, knocked on the door, explained what happened, and the old farmer was gracious enough to give her a ride home. She was covered head to toe in scrapes and oozing blood and was more tired than she had ever been in her entire life. But she was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when she finally got through her front door. Stephanie had gotten back shortly after they'd split up, and she figured Catherine had too, so she didn't bother to tell anybody that Catherine was still in the woods. And Catherine's family just figured she was just out playing after dark, since that was a pretty common thing for her to do. So nobody had been looking for her, and they were shocked when she walked in all beat up and crying. And to this day, Catherine wonders how long her family would have waited to come and find her if she hadn't been lucky enough to find that fence. And would it have been too late? And if this episode managed to just whet your appetite, click here for full creepy satisfaction. And we will see you again on the In-Between.